Hello and welcome to this session in which we will discuss aiding and abetting understatement of tax liability. The Internal Revenue Service, the government arms to collect taxes, is to do what? To raise as much money as possible. Therefore, the IRS sets rules for tax preparers to make sure they are following the rules and the regulation and they're not helping anyone understate their tax liability, report tax liability. Also, the IRS have rules against anyone, not only tax preparer, that is involved in helping or encouraging people or encouraging entities in understatement of taxes. So the rules of the IRS, although you can say, I'm not a tax professional, regardless, if you help or encourage someone to reduce their taxes, to understate their taxes, well, you could be liable for civil penalties. So this includes anyone who aids, assists, procures, or advises in the preparation, presentation, or any part of a tax return, affidavit, claim, or other document. Simply put, if you're helping someone to reduce their taxes, whether you are a CPA, tax preparers, enrolled agent, or anyone, you could be subject to a penalty. The penalty is applicable if the person involved knows or should have reasonably known. So you know it or you should have known it by your capacity, by your knowledge, that the part of the document that they are involved with will be used for a tax-related matter under the IRS. So they must be aware that their involvement would lead to an understatement of tax liability for someone else. Now bear in mind, this penalty is a civil penalty, and it's set for $1,000 for individual. If the offensive party is a corporation, it could be increased up to $10,000. So we need to learn a little bit more about this rule, and specifically knowing the difference between civil penalty and criminal penalty. Let's go ahead and get started. Before we proceed any further, I have a public announcement about my company, FarhatLectures.com. Farhat Accounting Lectures is a supplemental educational tool that's going to help you with your CPA exam preparation as well as your accounting courses. My CPA material is aligned with your CPA review course such as Becker, Roger, Wiley, Gleam, Miles. My accounting courses are aligned with your accounting courses, broken down by chapter and topics. My resources consist of lectures, multiple choice questions, true-false questions, as well as exercises. Go ahead, start your free trial today. Civil versus criminal. So this is a civil case. In most civil court cases, the burden of proof lies with the taxpayer. So if you are in a court situation and it's a civil situation against the IRS, the burden of proof, it means you have to prove you are right, lies on the taxpayer. That's civil. This means if the IRS takes a position in a dispute, the taxpayer, you have to demonstrate. It's your job to show otherwise by what we call preponderance of the evidence. That is what? That's the IRS position is not supported by the law or the evidence. So you have to show that you have the evidence to support your position against the IRS. Essentially, this means you must be more likely than not, over 50% probable, that your position is correct. When the issue is adding and abating, although it's a civil liability, the IRS must prove their involvement and intent for the penalty to be applied. So simply put, the IRS here must do the demonstration. So notice this is an exception to the rule. So in most civil cases, who has the burden of proof? The taxpayer. Well, if it's adding and abetting, although it's a civil case, just know it's an exception where the IRS will have to be on the other end proving their case. So the IRS burden of proof. Now in the US law, we have different standards. We have civil cases I just talked about. Civil typically involve disputes between individuals or entity, or criminal cases involving action that deemed offensive against the state or the society. So we have to understand the difference. What's the burden of proof between these two? As we said, in a civil case, it's the taxpayer. In a criminal case, we're going to see it's different. So an example in a civil case, let's assume the IRS claims that John did not report $10,000 of freelance income on his tax return. Now, because it's a civil case, the burden of proof on John. So John must prove that he did report all the income correctly. Well, he needs to show that all the money that went into his bank or all the invoices that were reported, that he reported his income accurately. It's his job to prove that. If he can show that's more likely than not that he reported all his income, well, he met the burden of proof in a civil case because it's on him. He has to report this. Versus if we have a criminal case. In criminal cases, the standard of proof is much higher. In criminal cases, the government, the IRS, bears the burden of proof. So it's the IRS will have to prove that you are guilty rather than you prove you are innocent in a civil case. They must establish that the taxpayer guilt, and it's not only guilt, beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a high standard. The standard is much, much higher. There's much stricter standard requiring evidence to be so convincing there would be no reasonable doubt in a rational person's mind that the taxpayer is guilty. So simply put, let's assume the government charges John with tax evasion. Tax evasion is a criminal case, claiming that he intentionally hid $10,000 of income to avoid paying taxes. Now this is a criminal case. Now the burden of proof in this criminal case is on the IRS. In the criminal case, the government must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that John intentionally evaded taxes. This means that they need to provide strong evidence that leaves no reasonable doubt in a rational person's mind that John on purpose hid this income. So the evidence must be more convincing compared to a civil case if John was charged with a civil case and he's just trying to show that he did report the income. In summary, in a civil case, John needs to show that it's more likely than not he is right. In a criminal case, it's the government that must prove John's guilt to a much higher standard, leaving no room for reasonable doubt. One more time, let's summarize. It's important once and for all. In civil dispute, the taxpayer must prove that they are more likely right than the IRS. In a criminal case, the government must prove that the taxpayer guilt to such a degree that there's no reasonable doubt of their guilt. So this distinction is important. It deals with the level of certainty required in a civil versus a criminal case. Let's take a look at this multiple choice questions, just to kind of make sure we are all on the same page. What does the burden of proof in a civil dispute typically requires? What does it require? The burden of proof. So if you are in a civil dispute tax, what would you need to do? Do you need to have beyond a reasonable doubt? Not at all. This is for criminal cases. And if you watch those TV shows like Law and Order and criminal cases, it's beyond, you have to be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal case, not a civil case. Is it probable cause? well, probable cause, it's a law enforcement. It's a law enforcement standard to justify search and arrest. Have a probable cause to arrest you, not a civil dispute. So probable cause is out. Hopefully, it just you if you don't know what this definition is now, you know what it is. Do you need to have clear and convincing evidence? Well, I would say clear and convincing evidence is closer to beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a high standard. It's a high standard. In a civil case, all what you need is a preponderance of the evidence, more than 50% chance that you are right and you should be in good shape. So the answer is B as in boy. So make sure you know the difference between a civil tax dispute, who has to make the case, and what's the level of the evidence required, versus a criminal case. In a criminal case, it's the government, and the standard is much, much higher beyond reasonable doubt. What should you do now? You want to go to Farhat lectures, look at additional MCQs, additional resources. That's going to help you whether you are studying for your CPA exam, enrolled agent, accounting courses. Invest in yourself, invest in your career. Good luck, study hard, and of course, stay safe.